Long before Babylon became a ruin, it became a story. A name spoken as much as it was imagined. A city that existed not only in brick and stone, but in language, myth, and warning. For thousands of years, Babylon did not need to be seen to be known. It lived in memory first, and that memory grew larger than the city itself. Babylon rose on the flat plains, between the Tigris and Euphrates, where land offered no natural protection and no obvious grandeur. There were no mountains to impress, no cliffs to dominate the horizon. Everything here had to be built: elevation, order, meaning itself. Babylon did not inherit power from geography. It manufactured it. This is where its story begins. In a landscape defined by floods and uncertainty, Babylon learned to control rhythm. Water was managed. Land was measured. Time was recorded. Long before the city reached imperial scale, it mastered something more fundamental: predictability. Crops followed calendars. Trade followed routes. Law followed writing. Babylon did not rely on memory alone. It wrote itself into permanence. That decision changed everything. Clay tablets replaced oral tradition. Contracts outlived voices. Laws became objects. Authority no longer depended entirely on presence. It could travel through text. Babylon understood early that power could be stored, not just in armies or walls, but in systems that endured beyond individual lives. This is why Babylon grew fast and why it lasted. The city expanded not as chaos, but as a plan. Streets aligned, districts specialized, temples rose as centers not only of worship, but of administration and astronomy. Babylon watched the sky with as much discipline as it watched the land. Stars were not decoration, they were data. The heavens became a grid, and Babylon learned how to read it. Order was the city's language, and order, when made visible, became a spectacle. Babylon's walls were not merely defensive, they were statements. Gates were not entrances, they were declarations. Processional routes did not guide movement, they staged it. To enter Babylon was to be reminded that this was a place where humans had imposed structure on chaos, symmetry on flood, meaning on plain earth. Then came the gardens, suspended greenery rising against flat land, water flowing upward, defying expectation, trees blooming where none should exist. The hanging gardens, whether real, symbolic, or exaggerated, became the city's most enduring image. Not because they were beautiful, but because they captured Babylon's core ambition: to make the impossible appear permanent. And that ambition would shape how Babylon was, remembered long after it was gone. Because Babylon did not simply fall, it was transformed into a metaphor, a symbol of excess, a warning about pride, a name used more often than it was understood. By the time the city began to empty, Babylon already existed in too many minds to disappear quietly. Unlike Cahokia, it would not dissolve into the land. Unlike Machu Picchu, it would not retreat into silence. Babylon would survive as an idea, long after bricks crumbled and canals dried, and that survival would come at a cost. Babylon's greatness did not come from mystery, it came from clarity. This was a city obsessed with definition, with naming, measuring, recording. Where other cultures trusted memory, Babylon trusted inscription. Clay tablets hardened decisions into objects. Words became tools. Once written, they could no longer be negotiated away by time. This was not just administration, it was a worldview. Reality was something to be fixed, catalogued, and enforced. Law was the most visible expression of this instinct. Rules were not whispered or implied, they were displayed. Punishment was proportional, explicit, and public. Justice was not flexible, but predictable. In Babylon, order did not depend on who you were speaking to. It depended on what had already been written. This shifted power away from individuals and towards systems. systems that could persist long after their creators were gone. That persistence was revolutionary. It allowed Babylon to scale beyond personality. Kings mattered, but the city did not depend on any single one to function. Bureaucracy outlived charisma. Record-keeping outlived memory. Trade networks extended far beyond the city's walls because agreements could be trusted without direct presence. Babylon became not just a place, but a framework, and frameworks spread. Merchants carried Babylonian measurements. Astronomers carried Babylonian calculations. Scribes carried Babylonian language across regions that never saw the city itself. Influence radiated outward not through conquest alone, but through adoption. To use Babylon's systems was to accept its authority quietly. This is how Babylon became unavoidable. Its power did not rely solely on spectacle, though it had plenty of that. It relied on standardization. Once people began to think in Babylonian units of time, of weight, of law, the city no longer needed to be physically present to govern behavior. Babylon was not only built in brick, it was built into thought. The Hanging Gardens fit perfectly into this logic, whether they rose in Babylon itself or existed. Only in later retellings their meaning was unmistakable. They were not a garden meant to blend into nature. They were nature reorganized to demonstrate control. Water lifted against gravity, plants arranged against climate. The gardens did not celebrate abundance. They advertised mastery. This mattered because Babylon's landscape offered no natural drama. Everything impressive here had to be made. Floods destroyed as easily as they nourished. Stability required constant intervention. Babylon did not accept this condition passively. It responded by turning management into identity. To be Babylonian was to believe that chaos could be ordered, that nature could be scheduled, that the world could be written into submission. For centuries this belief held. The city expanded, walls thickened, temples grew taller, processions became more elaborate. Babylon's image intensified until it no longer needed reality to sustain it. Stories traveled faster than merchants. Myths outlived kings. The city began to exist simultaneously in two forms, one of brick, one of imagination, and the imagined Babylon was larger. It was the imagined city that foreign writers described, the imagined city that later empires feared or admired, the imagined city that sacred texts turned into metaphor. Long before Babylon emptied, it had already escaped its geography. This is why its ending would be so strange. When the city's population thinned, when canals clogged and political gravity shifted elsewhere, Babylon did not disappear from memory the way Cahokia did. It became louder, more symbolic, more distorted. The real city shrank as the idea of Babylon grew. The bricks fell, the name did not, and that imbalance between what Babylon was and what it came to represent would shape everything that followed. As Babylon's physical presence began to weaken, its symbolic weight intensified. The city slipped into a strange afterlife where decline did not mean disappearance, but transformation. Power moved elsewhere, yet Babylon's name stayed rooted in language. It became a reference point, a shorthand for excess, ambition, order pushed too far. Few places experience this reversal, where the idea grows stronger precisely as the reality fades. This happened because Babylon had already solved the problem of distance. Through writing, standardization, and myth, it had learned how to exist beyond itself. Its stories were portable. Its warnings were reusable. Later empires did not need Babylon to function in order to invoke it. They needed only the image, and the image proved more durable than walls. As canals silted and trade routes shifted, the city's daily life narrowed. What had once been a hub of constant movement became quieter, less central. Administrative functions moved. Political attention drifted. Yet Babylon did not empty in panic. It thinned, it aged. It lingered as a place people passed through rather than gathered toward. The city's decline was gradual enough to feel almost intentional, as if Babylon itself were yielding space to the idea it had already become. This is where the hanging gardens take on their final role. Whether they stood in Babylon or were imagined elsewhere matters less than why they endured in memory. They represented the city's ultimate promise that human order could overcome environment, that beauty could be engineered, that permanence could be manufactured. In later retellings, the gardens grow taller, greener, more impossible. As reality receded, the symbol expanded to fill the gap. Eventually, Babylon no longer needed to exist to be used. Religious texts transformed it into a moral lesson. Historians turned it into a benchmark of lost greatness. Empires invoked it as a predecessor or a cautionary tale. Each retelling stripped away specifics and reinforced abstraction. Babylon became less a city and more a mirror, reflecting the anxieties and ambitions of whoever spoke its name. Meanwhile, the actual site continued its quiet retreat into the plain. Bricks were reused, structures collapsed inward, wind erased outlines that once staged power so carefully. Unlike Machu Picchu, Babylon did not retreat into isolation. Unlike Cahokia, it did not dissolve unnoticed. It remained known but misunderstood. Its presence was replaced by its reputation. This is the paradox at the heart of Babylon's story. The city achieved exactly what it set out to do. It imposed order, left records, shaped thought, but in doing so, it ensured that the version of Babylon that survived would no longer belong to the place itself. The city was remembered too well, and therefore incorrectly. Babylon did not vanish into silence. It vanished into language. And language, once detached from ground and brick, does not decay. It mutates, it amplifies, it simplifies. By the time the last inhabitants drifted away, Babylon was already everywhere else, quoted, warned, against, admired, condemned. The physical city had become optional. This is why Babylon feels so different from every other lost city. Its ruins are not its legacy. Its absence is not its mystery. Babylon's true remains are the stories that refused to let it end quietly, even when there was nothing left to see. Those stories hardened over time, even as the ground beneath them softened. Babylon's physical disappearance followed a familiar pattern: abandonment, reuse, erosion, but its narrative disappearance did not. Instead of being forgotten, the city was overused. Its name became a tool. It was invoked to explain decadence, to warn against arrogance, to symbolize excess without context. Babylon became a container for moral meaning rather than historical complexity. This transformation mattered more than its ruin. Once a city becomes a symbol, it stops being allowed to be ordinary. Babylon could no longer be understood as a place where people lived, worked, worried, and adapted. It was frozen into an idea of absolute power and inevitable downfall. The everyday mechanisms that sustained it, irrigation, accounting, astronomy, labor, were overshadowed by spectacle and judgment. Memory simplified what history had made intricate, and simplification is a form of erasure. As centuries passed, the physical site was visited less for understanding and more for confirmation. Travelers looked for what they already believed Babylon represented. When ruins failed to match expectation, imagination filled the gaps. Missing structures became proof of former greatness. Absence itself was turned into evidence. Babylon did not need to be seen clearly to be believed in. This inversion, where belief precedes evidence, is rare and dangerous. It allowed later societies to speak about Babylon without listening to it. The city's own voice, preserved in tablets and layout, was drowned out by the echo of its reputation. Babylon's obsession with writing ensured that records survived, Yet those records were often ignored in favor of stories that felt more useful to the present. What survived was not Babylon's system, but Babylon's warning, and warnings age poorly. They flatten nuance. They turn processes into morality. Plays, they reduce long adaptive histories into single moments of excess or collapse. Babylon's actual decline, slow, political, environmental, logistical, was replaced by a myth of sudden punishment. The city was not allowed to fade. It had to fall. This myth became stronger than archaeology. Even when ruins were uncovered, even when tablets spoke in precise administrative language, Babylon's image resisted correction. The idea had already outgrown the evidence. To revise Babylon was to weaken a symbol that had been doing cultural work for centuries, and cultures are often reluctant to surrender their symbols even when they are inaccurate. This is where Babylon's story turns quietly tragic, not because the city was destroyed, but because it was remembered incorrectly so completely that the truth struggled to matter. Babylon wanted to be permanent through systems, through law, writing, order. It succeeded, but those same systems allowed others to repurpose it endlessly. The city became less itself with every retelling until its physical absence barely mattered at all. In the end, Babylon did not lose control of its land first. It lost control of its meaning. And once meaning drifts far enough from place, no amount of excavation can fully bring it back. Once meaning drifted beyond recovery, Babylon entered its final state, not as a ruin, but as a reference. It became a word that carried weight without requiring understanding. People spoke of Babylon to describe decadence, corruption, excess, and inevitable downfall. The city was no longer asked to explain itself. It was used, and usage, repeated enough, replaces memory. Babylon's complexity, its engineering, its mathematics, its administrative genius was slowly overwritten by a simpler story that traveled more easily. This was the price of being remembered too well. Unlike cities that vanish and must be rediscovered, Babylon never had the chance to be forgotten properly. Its name was never allowed to rest. Each generation inherited a version of Babylon already shaped by fear, awe, or moral judgment. The physical city could not compete with the power of that inheritance. No excavation could fully undo centuries of symbolic accumulation, and yet beneath the myths, the reality remained stubborn. Clay tablets continued to surface, filled not with prophecy or excess, but with invoices, rations, star charts, legal disputes, and schedules. These were the fingerprints of a city that ran on precision rather than indulgence. Babylon was not chaotic. It was meticulous. It did not collapse under its own excess. It outlived many empires precisely because it was administratively boring in the ways that matter most. But boring does not survive myth. The Hanging Gardens illustrate this perfectly. They endure because they are visually irresistible. A vertical paradise in a flat land, an image that compresses Babylon's ambition into something instantly graspable. Whether they stood in Babylon or were relocated there by memory hardly matters. They survived because they fit the story people wanted Babylon to tell about itself. That it reached too high, that it defied nature, that it turned mastery into spectacle. In reality, Babylon's greatest defiance was quieter. It defied time by writing. It defied distance by standardizing. It defied uncertainty by measuring. These acts lack drama, but they change the world more reliably than wonders ever do. Babylon's influence shaped how later civilizations thought about law, astronomy, and governance. Its systems were copied, adapted, and absorbed so thoroughly that their origin was often forgotten. Babylon disappeared into success. This creates a strange inversion. The city that is remembered as a warning was, in practice, a foundation. Much of what made later empires possible, predictable law, recorded obligation, celestial calculation, passed through Babylon before becoming invisible through familiarity. The city was blamed for excess while its discipline quietly structured the future. As the story moves forward from here, Babylon no longer feels like a lost city in the conventional sense. It feels like a place that lost control over its own afterlife. Its bricks returned to earth, but its name escaped into language where it could no longer be, governed by fact. This is not the silence of Cahokia, nor the restraint of Machu Picchu. This is noise without ground. Babylon did not fade, it echoed, and echoes, once separated from their source, grow distorted with distance. As Babylon echoed forward through time, its original contours became harder to trace, not because evidence vanished, but because interpretation overwhelmed it. The city's legacy slipped out of archaeology and into metaphor, where accuracy mattered less than usefulness. Babylon became a narrative shortcut, a word that could carry entire arguments without needing detail. In that space, the real city, its planners, scribes, farmers, engineers, slowly disappeared behind the weight of what others needed Babylon to mean. This is the point where Babylon's story separates from most lost cities. Others vanish because they leave too little behind. Babylon vanished because it left too much, too many texts, too many references, too many stories layered on top of one another. Each layer made the city more famous and less knowable. By the time modern archaeology began peeling back those layers, Babylon had already been decided in the cultural imagination. Excavation could recover walls and tablets, but it could not easily compete with centuries of symbolism. What emerges instead is a tension between two Babylons that never fully reconcile. One is the historical city, pragmatic, bureaucratic, methodical, sustained by canals, contracts, and calculations. The other is the imagined Babylon, lush, decadent, arrogant, doomed by its own ambition. These two versions occupy the same name, but rarely the same conversation. The myth is easier to carry, easier to teach, easier to fear. The reality demands patience. As a result, Babylon's true disappearance is not spatial, but interpretive. The city is lost not because we cannot find it, but because it is rarely allowed to be ordinary. It must always be exceptional, either monstrously corrupt or impossibly grand. This strips Babylon of its most important quality, that it worked. For centuries, it functioned as a stable, adaptable urban system in one of the most difficult environments on Earth. Its longevity was not an accident, and its decline was not sudden. But these truths are quiet, and quiet truths struggle to survive inside loud myths. The Hanging Gardens remain the perfect symbol of this imbalance. They persist because they compress Babylon into a single spectacular image, one that feels worthy of legend. Whether they existed exactly as described matters less than what their survival in memory reveals. They outlived canals, laws, and star charts because wonder travels farther than systems. Babylon understood systems. The future preferred wonder. And yet, beneath the myth, Babylon's real influence never disappeared. Its ways of measuring time still shape calendars. Its approach to law still echoes in legal thinking. Its observations of the sky still underpin astronomy. These inheritances are so deeply integrated into later civilizations that they no longer feel Babylonian at all. The city dissolved into the foundations of others, leaving its name behind as a warning while its methods quietly endured. This is the final irony Babylon leaves us with. The city remembered as excess was, in practice, disciplined. The city remembered as fallen was, in reality, transformed. Babylon did not simply collapse into ruin. It fractured into two afterlives, one symbolic and loud, the other structural and invisible. The louder one claimed the name, the quieter one shaped the world. And in that split, Babylon became both everywhere and nowhere at once. physically eroded, intellectually diluted, but functionally immortal. That functional immortality is easy to miss because it lacks drama. Babylon's influence did not survive as a monument you can stand inside, but as habits of thought that feel natural precisely because their origins are forgotten. When time is divided predictably, when law is expected to be written, rather than remembered, when authority is embedded in procedure instead of personality, Babylon is already present. Its greatest success was becoming ordinary. This ordinariness, however, came at the cost of recognition. The more Babylon's systems spread, the less they were associated with the city itself. They became part of civilization's background machinery, stripped of authorship. Meanwhile, the name Babylon drifted in the opposite direction, toward exaggeration, moral symbolism, and abstraction. The city's practical genius and its legendary excess parted ways, each claiming a different afterlife. What makes this especially striking is that Babylon actively tried to prevent forgetting. It wrote obsessively. It recorded relentlessly. It stored memory in clay, assuming that permanence could be engineered. In a narrow sense, this worked. The tablets survived. The records endured. But memory does not survive on data alone. It survives on interpretation. And interpretation, once captured by myth, can overpower even the most meticulous archive. So Babylon became trapped by its own success. It created tools so powerful that later cultures could repurpose them without needing the city itself. Writing freed ideas from place. Standardization freed systems from origin. The very mechanisms Babylon used to secure its legacy allowed that legacy to detach and travel independently. What remained anchored to the land was not influence, but reputation. This creates a rare historical inversion. Most cities lose their systems first and their stories last. Babylon lost control of its story while its systems quietly lived on. The city was condemned as a warning while its methods were adopted as norms. This split explains why Babylon feels omnipresent and unreachable at the same time, invoked constantly, understood rarely. As the narrative continues to unfold, Babylon's decline no longer reads as failure. It reads as diffusion taken to an extreme. The city's power did not end when its walls fell. It ended when it no longer needed walls to matter. At that point, the physical city became optional. The idea was enough. And yet, ideas without anchors drift. Without the friction of place, Babylon's meaning became vulnerable to projection. Each era reshaped it to reflect its own anxieties about power, excess, and control. The city's name became a stage on which others performed their fears. In that process, Babylon's voice, precise, administrative, measured, was drowned out. What we are left with, then, is not a lost city in the traditional sense, but a misaligned one. Babylon exists, but out of phase with itself. Its material remains whisper pragmatism. Its reputation shouts warning. Reconciling the two requires effort, patience, and a willingness to let go of a myth that has been useful for far too long. That reconciliation is difficult, but it is also where Babylon becomes most relevant again. Not as a symbol of excess, but as a lesson in how power survives by becoming invisible and how civilizations can lose control of their own meaning even as their influence continues to shape the world. Reconciliation, when it comes, does not arrive as revelation. It arrives as discomfort. To see Babylon clearly requires holding two incompatible truths at once: that the city was both extraordinarily disciplined and endlessly mythologized, both foundational and misunderstood. Letting go of the familiar, Babylon, the decadent, cursed, excessive city, means accepting a version that feels less dramatic but far more consequential. A city that changed the world not through spectacle but through procedure. This is why Babylon resists closure. Every attempt to summarize it collapses into either myth or inventory. Lists of laws and measurements feel too dry, to explain its power. Stories of gardens and downfall feel too exaggerated to explain its longevity. The truth lives in the space between, where systems quietly reshape behavior over centuries while narratives race ahead, untethered from ground. Babylon's real achievement was not that it mastered chaos once, but that it taught others how to try. It showed that uncertainty could be managed, that nature could be scheduled, that society could be stabilized through repeatable rules. Later civilizations inherited this confidence even when they rejected Babylon's name. They learned to trust calendars, contracts, and calculations without needing to remember where those habits came from. And yet, this inheritance carried a subtle cost. As systems spread, they normalized control. What began as a solution to unpredictability hardened into expectation. Order became default. Deviation became threat. Babylon's gift was powerful, but it was not neutral. The same tools that made large societies possible also made them rigid. The city that once thrived on clarity eventually became a symbol of what happens when clarity turns into excess certainty. This is where Babylon's myth begins to make sense, not as history but as response. The stories of hubris and downfall are not records of what happened there. They are reactions to what Babylon made possible elsewhere. As empires grew larger and more confident, Babylon became a warning, retroactively assigned to the origin of order itself. The city was blamed not for its own sins, but for the consequences of its success. In this way, Babylon was punished in memory for being effective. Its name absorbed centuries of anxiety about power that outlived its creators. The physical city faded, but the cautionary tale grew louder, as if history needed Babylon to fall in order to feel safe using the tools it left behind. What remains now is an uneven legacy, a city whose methods underpin modern life, whose name is still used to condemn excess, and whose actual reality sits quietly in the soil, waiting to be read without the filter of expectation. Babylon does not ask to be admired or forgiven. It asks to be understood without metaphor. As the story continues, Babylon moves closer to its final form, not as a place we can recover fully, but as a tension we must accept between order and freedom, between permanence and adaptability, between systems that endure and meanings that drift. Babylon lived inside that tension longer than most cities ever do. And when it finally slipped out of it, what remained was not silence, but imbalance. A city remembered too loudly in the wrong ways and too quietly in the right ones. As Babylon moves deeper into this phase, the distance between what the city was and what it became in memory grows impossible to close. Archaeology can recover walls, tablets, foundations, but it cannot recover authority over meaning. Too many centuries have already spoken over the city. Babylon no longer belongs only to its ground. It belongs to everyone who has ever used its name to explain fear, ambition, or excess. The physical city becomes evidence, while the imagined one remains argument. This is why Babylon can never be fully reclaimed. Any attempt to restore it to a single accurate narrative runs into resistance, not from lack of data, but from saturation. The city is already full of meanings assigned by others. Each layer of interpretation hardens the myth and pushes the lived reality further out of reach. Babylon is not buried beneath sand alone. It is buried beneath stories that refuse to loosen their grip. What makes this especially striking is that Babylon itself encouraged permanence. It believed that writing could defeat time, that order could outlast individuals, that systems could stabilize the future. In many ways it was right. Its methods survived, its influence persisted. But permanence took a form the city could not control. The systems lived on, while the city that created them became optional. Survival arrived without fidelity, At this point, Babylon's decline no longer resembles a fall. It resembles a slow transfer of relevance. Political power moved elsewhere. Trade followed. New routes, capitals rose that borrowed Babylonian tools while rejecting Babylonian identity. The city did not collapse inward. It was bypassed. Attention drifted, and with it necessity. Babylon did not stop existing in a moment. It stopped mattering in one. This kind of ending leaves no clean boundary. There is no last day, no final ruler, no singular catastrophe to point to. The city simply receded from the center of the world it helped organize. Its canals clogged, its walls decayed, its population thinned, but its ideas remained active elsewhere. Babylon's greatest export was not empire, it was normality. And normality is the easiest thing to forget the origin of. As Babylon faded into the background of daily life, its name detached completely from its function. What remained was a symbolic shell, ready to be, filled with whatever meaning later societies required. The city became a warning about excess precisely because it had once been so effective at creating order. It became a moral example because it had demonstrated how far control could go. The myth did not replace the truth by accident. It replaced it because it was more emotionally useful. Here, Babylon reaches the end of what it can explain about itself. From this point forward, the story no longer belongs to the city alone. It belongs to the civilizations that inherited its tools without inheriting its context. To understand Babylon now is to recognize how easily systems outlive their origins, and how quickly meaning drifts once place is no longer necessary. This is where the fourth movement begins to close, not with resolution, but with imbalance fully exposed. A city remembered louder than it is. Understood. A civilization whose influence is everywhere, while its reality remains fragmented. Babylon stands here not as a ruin to be completed, but as a reminder that power can survive its source, and that survival does not guarantee accuracy. From this point on, the story must turn outward, away from Babylon itself, and toward what its afterlife reveals about empires, memory, and the human need to turn systems into myths once they grow too large to question. That outward turn is unavoidable because Babylon's afterlife says less about the city itself than about the cultures that came after it. Once Babylon ceased to be necessary as a place, it became necessary as a reference. Later, empires did not inherit Babylon's land, but they inherited its confidence. The belief that order could be imposed, that complexity could be managed, that human systems could rival natural forces. When those later systems strained or failed, Babylon was waiting, ready to be blamed. This is how Babylon became a moral container. It absorbed responsibility for anxieties it did not create alone. The excess of later empires, the rigidity of later laws, the arrogance of later rulers, all could be projected backward onto a city that no longer had the power to answer for itself. Babylon became a cautionary tale because caution needed an origin, and Babylon's name was already heavy enough to carry it. What gets lost in this process is proportion. Babylon was ambitious, but it was also careful. It managed floods more often than it defied nature. It solved logistical problems long before it staged spectacles. Its greatness lay in repetition, not exception. But repetition does not survive well in storytelling. Myth prefers the singular, the dramatic, the irreversible. So Babylon's long, patient competence was compressed into a single image of overreach. This compression marks the end of Babylon as a historical subject and the beginning of Babylon as a cultural instrument. From that point on, the city no longer needed accuracy. It needed resonance. It needed to feel ancient, powerful, and dangerous enough to make lessons stick. The hanging gardens, the towering walls, the sudden fall, these images endured not because they were verified, but because they were effective. By now, Babylon exists in a permanent imbalance. Its material remains are too fragmentary to compete with its symbolic weight, and its symbolic weight is too entrenched to be fully corrected by material evidence. Archaeology can clarify details, but it cannot undo centuries of narrative use. Babylon has been told too many times in too many ways to return to a single truth. This is where the fourth movement finally settles. Babylon is no longer a city moving through time. It is time moving through a city that cannot respond. Its decline is not a lesson about failure, but about distortion, about how power, once separated from place, becomes available for misuse, about how memory can outgrow reality until reality feels irrelevant. At this point in the story, Babylon has finished explaining itself. What remains is the question it leaves behind for everything that followed. When systems survive longer than their creators, who controls their meaning? And when meaning drifts far enough from origin, does accuracy still matter? Or does usefulness always win? That question carries us forward into the next phase of the story, where Babylon is no longer examined for what it was, but for what it made possible, and for the cost of turning a functioning city into an eternal myth. That cost becomes clearer the farther Babylon recedes into the past. When a city is turned into myth, it stops being allowed to change. It becomes fixed, frozen in a single moral posture. Babylon was locked into excess, arrogance, and inevitable downfall, even though its real history was adaptive, administrative, and prolonged. This freezing of meaning did more than misrepresent Babylon. It reshaped how later societies understood power itself. Complexity became suspicious. Scale became dangerous. Order became something that must eventually be punished. In this way, Babylon's myth began to discipline the future. Empires that followed inherited Babylon's systems while fearing Babylon's fate. They used writing, law, and measurement, but framed these tools within narratives of restraint and warning. The city's name hovered in the background as a reminder of what not to become. Babylon became a limit case, a story used to draw boundaries around ambition, even as ambition quietly relied on Babylonian foundations to function at all. This contradiction is the final tension Babylon leaves behind. A city that enabled large-scale civilization, yet became a symbol used to condemn it. A place whose greatest contribution was stability, yet whose memory is dominated by collapse. Babylon did not fail in the way history insists it did. It succeeded so thoroughly that later cultures needed to turn it into a warning in order to feel morally safe using its inventions. This is why Babylon feels unresolved. There is no clean ending where the city falls and meaning follows. Instead, the physical city dwindles while the symbolic city expands uncontrollably. Ruins sink into the plain as the idea of Babylon rises higher, detached from geography, free to be reshaped endlessly. The two trajectories never meet again. As the story moves toward its final stretch, Babylon no longer needs to be explained through archaeology or legend alone. It needs to be understood as a split legacy, one half embedded quietly in the systems that still organize modern life, the other half roaming freely in language, religion, and metaphor, untethered from evidence. This split is not unique to Babylon, but Babylon is where it becomes most visible, because no other city was so thoroughly written, so carefully ordered, and so aggressively remembered and misunderstood at the same time. Babylon trusted that writing would preserve truth. It did not account for how easily truth could be repurposed once it outlived its place. In the end, Babylon did not disappear because it was forgotten. It disappeared because it was remembered too loudly in the wrong way. And that may be the most modern ending imaginable. That modernity is what makes Babylon linger long after its walls failed. It shows how memory can become more powerful than material reality, and how power itself can migrate from ground into narrative. Once that migration happens, correction becomes almost impossible. Evidence no longer competes with myth on equal terms. It must argue while myth simply repeats. Babylon's fate was sealed not when it declined as a city, but when it became useful as a story. From that moment on, Babylon could no longer belong to itself. Every era that followed inherited a version of the city already shaped by fear or fascination. Theologians turned it into a symbol of moral decay. Historians framed it as a peak followed by inevitable punishment. Empires referenced it to define their own limits. In all of these uses, Babylon was less a subject than a tool. Its complexity was inconvenient. Its endurance was awkward. What mattered was what the name could do, and the name could do a lot. It could warn populations against excess. It could justify restraint or conquest. It could turn order into suspicion and ambition into guilt. Meanwhile, the real Babylon, its scribes, engineers, planners, remained silent, their voices preserved in tablets few would ever read. Their city had mastered permanence through writing, yet writing alone could not protect meaning once context dissolved. The systems survived, the intention behind them did not. This is the quiet lesson Babylon leaves behind. That control over systems does not guarantee control over legacy, that writing preserves data, not interpretation. That power, once abstracted, becomes available to anyone who needs it. As the story approaches its final movement, Babylon no longer stands as a place to be recovered. It stands as a warning about recovery itself, about the limits of reconstruction, about the danger of believing that more information will automatically restore truth. Sometimes the story is already too loud. What remains possible, however, is recalibration, not by erasing the myth, but by placing it back beside the city it replaced, by allowing Babylon to be both less dramatic and more influential than legend allows, by recognizing that its true legacy was not excess but normalization, the moment when order became expected rather than extraordinary. This recalibration does not redeem Babylon. It repositions it. And in that repositioning, the city finally comes back into focus, not as a moral endpoint, not as a fallen wonder, but as a turning point, a place where humanity learned how to store power in systems and where it also learned how easily those systems could escape their creators. Babylon did not fall into ruin and vanish. It stepped into language and lost control, and that loss, more than any collapse, marks the end of the city's story and the beginning of something far harder to contain, a civilization whose tools survived intact while its meaning drifted free, shaping the world in ways it could no longer guide. That drift is where Babylon finally stops being ancient and becomes timeless. Once a civilization's tools detach from its place of origin, they no longer age in the usual way. They do not erode with walls or crumble with bricks. They embed themselves into habits, assumptions, and expectations. Babylon's calendars, contracts, measurements, and administrative logic did exactly that. They slipped into the bloodstream of later societies, invisible precisely because they worked. What endured was not remembered as Babylonian, it was remembered as normal. And normality is the deepest form of survival. This is why Babylon's ruins feel strangely quiet compared to its reputation. Standing on the site, there is no immediate sense of excess or arrogance. There is earth, broken walls, fragments of foundation. The spectacle exists elsewhere, in texts, sermons, metaphors. Babylon's physical remains are modest, almost restrained. The imbalance between ground and memory is so extreme that it becomes the final clue to understanding the city. Babylon was not built to impress eternity. It was built to organize the present. Its greatness lay in making large, complex societies feel manageable, in turning unpredictability into schedule, in translating chaos into procedure. That achievement does not leave behind wonders. It leaves behind Expectations, and expectations once established rarely credit their origin. The Hanging Gardens persist because they promise wonder. Babylon persists because it delivered control. Between those two, history chose wonder. As this section of the story closes, Babylon's true loss becomes clear. It did not lose its people first, or its power, or its buildings. It lost the ability to define itself. Once others began speaking for Babylon more loudly than Babylon could speak for itself, the city's fate was sealed. Its name would travel farther than its reality ever could. This is not a tragedy in the classical sense. It is an outcome of success so complete that it dissolved its own authorship, an outcome of systems so effective that they outlived the place that created them. Babylon became foundational and forgettable at the same time, used constantly, understood rarely, and this is where the fourth movement truly ends, not with collapse, not with disappearance, but with dislocation. A city separated from its meaning, a name separated from its ground, a civilization that survived by becoming invisible in practice and exaggerated in memory. From here, the story must move into its final chapters, where Babylon's legacy collides with empire, hubris, and eventual irrelevance, and where the Hanging Gardens return one last time, not as a question of whether they existed, but of why we needed them to. That is where Babylon's story becomes most revealing. Not about the past, but about how humans choose the versions of history they want to carry forward. As Babylon enters this final phase of its story, the city is no longer struggling against enemies or nature, but against time's most subtle force: reinterpretation. Empires rise and fall around it, yet Babylon is already elsewhere, circulating as a concept rather than a location. Its decline does not produce a vacuum because its systems have already been absorbed into broader civilizational practice. Writing, law, administration, and astronomical calculation no longer require Babylon to exist in order to function. They have been unmoored from origin and normalized. What disappears is not capability, but attribution, and this loss of attribution ensures that Babylon's influence will be both permanent and anonymous. This anonymity creates a strange paradox. Babylon becomes increasingly irrelevant as a place. At the exact moment, it becomes indispensable as an idea. Its ruins can be ignored, reused, or eroded without consequence. Because the city's authority no longer resides in stone or brick, it resides in habits so deeply ingrained that they feel inevitable. When societies expect laws to be written, when contracts are trusted beyond personal relationships, when time itself is segmented and scheduled, Babylon's logic is already present, operating without credit. The city survives by disappearing into function. Yet function alone is never enough for memory. Human cultures crave narrative, and narrative demands characters, warnings, and symbols. Babylon's efficiency offers little emotional traction, so it is reshaped into excess. The city becomes a stage for moral storytelling, a cautionary emblem rather than a technical achievement. This transformation is not accidental. It satisfies a need to believe that immense power must contain a fatal flaw, that order, pushed far enough, becomes sin, that control inevitably invites collapse. Babylon is chosen to carry this burden because it is already distant enough to resist correction. The Hanging Gardens return here as the perfect bridge between reality and desire. They condense Babylon into an image that feels complete: beauty, engineered against nature, mastery turned ornamental, ambition made visible. Whether they existed matters less than why they endured. They survive because they express in a single picture what centuries of narrative wanted Babylon to represent: a city that reached too far, too high, too confidently. The gardens are not evidence of Babylon's truth. They are evidence of the stories later civilizations needed Babylon to tell. As this narrative solidifies, Babylon's actual end becomes almost irrelevant. The city does not need a dramatic fall because it has already been fixed in. Cultural memory has fallen. Its political marginalization, environmental challenges, and gradual abandonment cannot compete with the clarity of myth. History prefers clean endings, and Babylon's slow fading offers none. So myth supplies one instead. In doing so, it freezes the city in a role it never consciously chose, locking its name to warning rather than achievement. This is where Babylon's story crosses its final threshold. It is no longer a subject of history, but a mechanism within it, a reference point used to regulate ambition, to moralize power, to simplify the past into lessons that feel usable. The real city cannot argue back. Its voice remains buried in tablets and foundations, precise but quiet. The myth, meanwhile, speaks fluently to fear and desire, and so it wins attention by default. From this point forward, Babylon's fate is sealed not by destruction, but by utility. It will continue to be cited, condemned, admired, and misunderstood long after its ruins dissolve into the plain. Its systems will continue shaping societies that no longer recognize them as inherited. Its name will continue circulating, detached from ground, detached from accuracy, but rich in symbolic force. Babylon becomes what few cities ever do, a place that ends physically while remaining active conceptually, exerting influence without presence. And in that condition, Babylon reaches its most enduring form. Not as a city you can walk through, not as a ruin demanding preservation, but as a ghost embedded in how civilization understands order itself. The city is gone, but the assumptions it normalized remain. Babylon does not survive by being remembered correctly. It survives by being unavoidable. This unavoidable presence is where Babylon finally stops belonging to history and starts belonging to structure, because structures do not ask where. They come from once they work. The city's legacy dissolves into assumptions so ordinary that questioning them feels unnatural, and this is the most complete form of survival any civilization can achieve. Babylon no longer needs defenders or admirers. It operates silently beneath expectations about law, time, authority, and order. At the same time, its name continues to float above those systems as a warning, disconnected from the labor that created them, transformed into a moral symbol rather than a technical achievement. This split ensures that Babylon is never encountered whole. One half of it lives in daily life, anonymous and essential, while the other half lives in language, exaggerated and simplified. The physical city fades because it no longer carries the weight of what it produced, and the stories grow heavier because they no longer need the city to restrain them. In this final state, Babylon becomes a lesson not about excess or collapse, but about how civilizations lose ownership of their meaning once their tools outgrow their origin. The Hanging Gardens endure not because they define Babylon, but because they replace it, offering a single image where a complex system once stood. Order becomes myth, administration becomes arrogance, and longevity becomes hubris. All because stories are easier to carry than processes. Babylon does not resist this transformation because it no longer can. Its systems have already moved on, embedded elsewhere, indifferent to how their birthplace is remembered. What remains is a city that cannot be recovered because it was too successful to remain itself. A civilization that solved permanence so effectively that it erased the need for its own presence. Babylon ends not with silence or ruin, but with absorption, its reality, flattened into metaphor, while its influence continues uninterrupted, shaping worlds that no longer recognize its name as anything more than a warning. Absorption is the quietest ending a city can have, and Babylon's is complete. Nothing dramatic marks the moment when it finally slips out of relevance as a place, because relevance has already migrated elsewhere. The city no longer needs inhabitants, walls, or even memory to continue influencing the world. Its logic persists without ceremony, without attribution, and without resistance. What once required priests, scribes, and administrators now feels automatic, as if order itself were a natural feature of human life rather than a carefully constructed achievement with a specific origin. Babylon becomes invisible not because it failed, but because it succeeded too thoroughly. This success creates a final distortion. When a civilization's contributions become indistinguishable from normality, its name is freed to mean anything. Babylon's label is no longer anchored to canals, tablets, or measurements, so it drifts toward extremes. It becomes a symbol of corruption rather than coordination, excess rather than efficiency, downfall rather than durability. The city is remembered for what later cultures feared about power, not for what it actually accomplished with it. In this way, Babylon is rewritten by the anxieties of those who inherited its tools without inheriting its context. What is lost here is not information, but balance. Babylon's story becomes asymmetrical, heavy with moral judgment and light on mechanics. The patient work of sustaining a massive urban system on an unforgiving plain disappears behind images of towers, gardens, and divine punishment. The city's true struggle, maintaining stability over centuries through constant management, offers little spectacle, so it is quietly erased. History keeps the image that warns and discards the process that explains. This is why Babylon feels perpetually unfinished. No excavation, no translation, no reconstruction can fully restore it, because the city's problem is not absence of evidence, but excess of interpretation. Babylon is not buried too deep in the ground, it is buried too deep in meaning. Every attempt to clarify it must first cut through centuries of symbolic use that have little interest in accuracy. The city has been turned into a function of storytelling, and storytelling rarely tolerates complexity without resolution. As Babylon approaches the end of its narrative arc, it stands as a mirror rather than a monument. It reflects how civilizations choose what to remember and what to simplify, how systems outlive places, and how meaning detaches from origin once success becomes widespread. Babylon does not accuse later societies of distortion. It reveals a pattern. Power creates tools, tools spread, origins fade, symbols fill the gap. In this pattern, Babylon is not unique, but it is early and clear. It shows what happens when human order becomes strong enough to survive its birthplace, and how quickly that survival turns into misrepresentation. The city does not vanish into obscurity like Cahokia, nor does it retreat into silence like Machu Picchu. It dissolves into ubiquity, remembered everywhere in the wrong way and nowhere in the right one. And that is where Babylon finally rests, not as a lost city waiting to be rediscovered, but as a permanent distortion embedded in civilization itself. Its ground lies quiet, its name remains loud, and its influence continues without introduction. Babylon ends not by disappearing, but by becoming unavoidable, a city that no longer needs to exist to shape the world that outgrew it. Inherits its tools without acknowledging their origin, reenacts the same pattern. Order becomes routine, routine becomes invisible, and invisibility invites myth. Babylon is reborn each time this cycle completes, not as a city, but as a reference used to explain unease about power that feels too stable, too confident, too assured of itself. The city's name survives because it is useful for expressing doubt, not because it accurately reflects what once stood. On the Mesopotamian plain, what makes this ending so unsettling is that Babylon never loses relevance. It only loses precision. It remains present in discourse precisely because it is no longer tied to specifics. No canal depth needs to be remembered, no tablet translated, no street reconstructed. Babylon is invoked whole as a warning already agreed upon, its meaning assumed rather than examined. This is the final stage of mythification, where the story no longer asks to be verified, only repeated. In this form, Babylon cannot be corrected without losing its function. To return nuance to the city would weaken the clarity of the lesson people believe. It teaches the idea of Babylon as excess, arrogance, and inevitable punishment is emotionally efficient. It resolves anxiety about power by promising consequences. The real Babylon, with its careful management and long survival, offers no such comfort. It suggests that order can last, that control can work, and that decline is not always dramatic or deserved. That truth is harder to live with, so it is rarely chosen. This is where Babylon's true disappearance occurs, not when its walls fall, not when its population thins, but when its complexity becomes inconvenient. From that moment on, the city is no longer allowed to be what it was. It must become what later societies needed to be. The hanging gardens endure because they satisfy that need, offering a single striking image that replaces an entire system. They give form to a story that prefers spectacle over structure, wonder over administration. Babylon's final legacy, then, is not a ruin or a marvel, but a warning about memory itself. It shows how easily civilizations surrender accuracy in exchange for meaning, and how quickly meaning hardens into myth once it proves useful. Babylon does not vanish because it is forgotten, it vanishes because it is simplified until nothing remains that can argue back. And so the city reaches its end not in silence, but in repetition, repeated as metaphor, repeated as caution, repeated as shorthand. Its ground remains quiet, its systems live on anonymously, and its name continues to circulate untethered from truth. Babylon becomes a place that exists everywhere, except where it once stood, a city that solved permanence so thoroughly that it erased the need for its own presence. In that sense, Babylon is not lost. It is absorbed, flattened, and endlessly reused. Its reality traded for resonance. And that trade once made cannot be undone. By the time Babylon reaches this stage, the city has completed a rare transformation from place into principle, and principles do not age the way cities do. They are reused, reframed, and reapplied wherever they seem to fit, often without regard for where they came from. Babylon's principle was order, made legible, power made predictable, chaos made administrable, and once those ideas proved effective, they could no longer be contained by geography. The city that invented them became secondary to the habits they produced, and history quietly shifted its attention from the source to the outcome. This shift explains why Babylon feels both omnipresent and unreachable at once. It is everywhere in effect and nowhere in form. Its physical remains cannot compete with the scale of what it normalized, and its name cannot accurately represent the discipline that once defined it. What survives instead is a flattened image, endlessly repeated because it satisfies a psychological need to believe that great systems inevitably collapse under their own weight. That belief offers comfort because it suggests limits on power, even as societies continue to rely on the very tools Babylon perfected. In this contradiction, Babylon finds its final resting place, not as a city waiting to be reconstructed, but as a pattern that keeps repeating whenever human organization grows confident enough to forget its origins. The hanging gardens linger as a visual shorthand for that confidence, a symbol, chosen not for accuracy but for resonance, standing in for an entire civilization whose true achievement was far less romantic and far more enduring. Babylon does not end with ruins reclaimed by sand or silence reclaimed by time. It ends by becoming inseparable from the way civilization understands itself, its name drifting free of its ground while its logic continues to shape the world without permission or credit. Once Babylon reaches this state, there is no return to innocence, either for the city or for those who inherit its legacy. The knowledge that order can be designed, written, and enforced permanently alters how societies imagine themselves, and Babylon was among the first to demonstrate this at full scale. After that demonstration, the question was never whether order could exist, but how much of it could be sustained without turning against the people it organized. Babylon's myth answers that question with fear, but its history answers it with endurance. And the tension between those two answers never resolves. This unresolved tension is why Babylon remains so useful long after its stones have crumbled. It allows later civilizations to externalize their anxieties about control by projecting them backward onto a distant city. Babylon becomes the place where certainty went too far, where systems became suffocating, where ambition forgot restraint. In doing so, later societies absolve themselves while continuing to build ever more complex structures on Babylonian foundations. The warning is accepted, but the tools are kept. Here, Babylon reveals something uncomfortable about historical memory. We do not remember the past to understand it. We remember it to manage the present. Cities like Babylon are reshaped to serve emotional and moral needs rather than factual ones. Its image is curated to stabilize modern fears about bureaucracy, power, and permanence. The real city, with its patient calculations and administrative discipline, offers little relief from those fears, so it is quietly set aside. What remains extraordinary is how completely Babylon disappears as a lived place while remaining active as a concept. People no longer need to know where Babylon stood or how it functioned in order to invoke it. The city survives as a reflex, a word that signals danger without demanding explanation. In this form, Babylon no longer belongs to archaeologists or historians. It belongs to language itself, and language does not preserve nuance. It compresses, it sharpens. It chooses what travels easily and discards what does not. Babylon's true legacy, long-term stability through systemization, is too subtle, too technical, too slow for this process. What survives instead is spectacle, excess, and downfall. The city becomes a caricature of its own success. This is the final irony Babylon leaves behind. It was a civilization that believed deeply in record, structure, and permanence, yet it lost control of its own meaning more completely than cities that left almost nothing behind. Cahokia vanished because it dissolved quietly. Babylon vanished because it echoed too loudly. Both were lost, but in opposite ways. At the end of this arc, Babylon stands not as a lesson about pride alone, but as a lesson about memory's violence, about how even the most carefully constructed order cannot protect itself from being rewritten by those who come after, about how influence, once detached from place, becomes impossible to govern. Babylon does not ask us to admire or condemn it. It asks something far more difficult: to recognize how easily civilizations trade accuracy for meaning, and how readily we accept simplified pasts that make the present feel safer. The city is gone, its name remains, and its systems persist unseen. That combination ensures that Babylon is never truly finished, only reinterpreted again and again, each time further from the ground where it first stood. At the point where Babylon can no longer be recovered as a single truth, the fourth movement draws to its natural close, not with resolution, but with recognition. The city has crossed a threshold beyond which evidence and meaning no longer travel together, and no amount of excavation can fully reunite them. Babylon's tablets can tell us how grain was counted, how time was measured, how law was enforced, but they cannot undo the centuries in which Babylon's name was repurposed to explain fear, excess, and collapse. The city becomes a case study in how history fractures when systems survive longer than their context, and how memory selects what is emotionally useful rather than structurally accurate. Babylon does not vanish because it is unknowable. It vanishes because it is overknown in the wrong way, pinned to a myth that refuses correction. This is the quiet end of the fourth phase. A city whose reality remains buried beneath interpretation, whose influence continues without attribution, and whose name has drifted so far from its ground that returning it to balance is no longer possible. From here, the story must move forward, not by looking deeper into Babylon itself, but by following what happens after its centrality fades. When power shifts, empires rise elsewhere, and Babylon, still intact as a symbol, begins to lose relevance as a place, setting the stage for the next movement where decline is not collapse, but displacement. As displacement takes hold, Babylon's story enters a quieter but more decisive phase, one defined not by destruction but by redirection. Power does not rush out of the city. It slowly finds other centers more convenient to serve changing routes, new empires, and different priorities. Administration migrates, trade follows fresh corridors, political gravity shifts without ceremony. Babylon remains standing, but it is no longer necessary, and necessity is the true engine of urban life. The city becomes a place people remember passing through rather than moving toward, a former center whose greatest achievement, stability, now makes its absence of drama almost invisible. There is no single moment when Babylon falls from relevance. There's only a widening gap between where systems operate and where the city still stands. This gap marks the beginning of Babylon's irrelevance as a hub, even as its symbolic weight remains intact. What makes this phase so difficult to recognize is that Babylon does not behave like a failed city. It is not sacked into oblivion or erased overnight. It simply becomes inefficient. New capitals arise that borrow Babylonian tools while discarding Babylonian location. Empires learn that order can be transported without carrying the city that perfected it. Once that lesson is absorbed, Babylon's physical presence becomes optional. The city is no longer the best place to do what it once did best, and that realization, more than any enemy, seals its fate. Here, Babylon's long preparation for permanence works against it because it invested so heavily in systems rather than spectacle alone. Those systems can be lifted out and reused elsewhere. They do not require Babylon's streets or temples to function. Writing moves easily. Law adapts. Measurement travels. Astronomy follows the sky, not the city. Babylon's greatest strength, its portability through structure, ensures that its decline will be silent. Nothing breaks, nothing demands attention. The city simply stops being central. As this happens, Babylon's symbolic life continues independently, almost mockingly, while the real city fades into regional significance, the imagined. Babylon grows ever larger in the minds of distant cultures. The two trajectories no longer intersect. Babylon, the place, becomes increasingly local. Babylon, the idea, becomes universal. This separation finalizes the city's transformation from participant in history to reference within it. Its ground matters less each year, even as its name is repeated more often than ever. This is where the fifth movement begins to take shape, not as collapse, but as evaporation of relevance. Babylon does not end with fire or conquest. It ends when the world no longer needs it to be where it is, and once necessity leaves, everything else follows quietly after. As displacement takes hold, Babylon's story enters a quieter but more decisive phase, one defined not by destruction but by redirection. Power does not rush out of the city. It slowly finds other centers more convenient to serve changing routes, new empires, and different priorities. Administration migrates, Trade follows fresh corridors. Political gravity shifts without ceremony. Babylon remains standing, but it is no longer necessary, and necessity is the true engine of urban life. The city becomes a place people remember passing through rather than moving toward. A former center whose greatest achievement, stability, now makes its absence of drama almost invisible. There is no single moment when Babylon falls from relevance. There is only a widening gap between where systems operate and where the city still stands. This gap marks the beginning of Babylon's irrelevance as a hub, even as its symbolic weight remains intact. What makes this phase so difficult to recognize is that Babylon does not behave like a failed city. It is not sacked into oblivion or erased overnight. It simply becomes inefficient. New capitals arise that borrow Babylonian tools while discarding Babylonian location. Empires learn that order can be transported without carrying the city that perfected it. Once that lesson is absorbed, Babylon's physical presence becomes optional. The city is no longer the best place to do what it once did best, and that realization, more than any enemy, seals its fate. Here, Babylon's long preparation for permanence works against it because it invested so heavily in systems rather than spectacle alone. Those systems can be lifted out and reused elsewhere. They do not require Babylon's streets or temples to function. Writing moves easily. Law adapts. Measurement travels. Astronomy follows the sky, not the city. Babylon's greatest strength, its portability through structure, ensures that its decline will be silent. Nothing breaks, nothing demands attention. The city simply stops being central. As this happens, Babylon's symbolic life continues independently, almost mockingly. While the real city fades into regional significance, the imagined Babylon grows ever larger in the minds of distant cultures. The two trajectories no longer intersect. Babylon, the place, becomes increasingly local. Babylon, the idea, becomes universal. This separation finalizes the city's transformation from participant in history to reference within it. Its ground matters less each year, even as its name is repeated more often than ever. This is where the fifth movement begins to take shape, not as collapse, but as evaporation of relevance. Babylon does not end with fire or conquest. It ends when the world no longer needs it to be where it is. And once necessity leaves, everything else follows quietly after. That quiet following is what defines Babylon's final centuries as a living city. Life continues, but without momentum. The walls still stand, the streets still exist, the land still bears memory of order, yet the currents that once fed them have shifted elsewhere. Babylon becomes a remnant of a former logic, impressive in scale, but misaligned with the world now organizing itself around different axes of power. This is not decay in the dramatic sense. It is misfit. The city remains capable but no longer optimal, and history has little patience for places that are merely adequate when others promise efficiency. What replaces Babylon's centrality is not chaos, but competition. New capitals rise that understand Babylon's lesson too well. They adopt its systems, while shedding its burdens. They learn that administration does not need ancestry, that authority does not need continuity, that order can be rebuilt without honoring where it came from. Babylon's tools become modular, detachable. And once they are detachable, the city itself becomes unnecessary. Its survival is no longer tied to its usefulness. This is where Babylon's decline becomes irreversible, not because it cannot recover, but because there is nothing left to recover toward. The world that needed Babylon as a center no longer exists. Trade has found shorter paths. Empires have found more strategic locations. Power has learned to move. Babylon's landscape, once an advantage mastered through discipline, now feels like friction. Floods require maintenance no longer justified. Canals demand labor no longer rewarded. Stability becomes a cost rather than an asset. Yet even as Babylon loses relevance, it does not lose dignity. It does not lash out. It does not reinvent itself dramatically. It persists, quietly almost, stubbornly, as if unsure that history has truly moved on. This persistence is often mistaken for resilience, but it is closer to inertia. The city is no longer shaping the world. It is waiting for the world to remember why it once mattered. Meanwhile, memory continues its own work. The farther Babylon drifts from relevance as a place, the easier it becomes to reshape as a story. Distance simplifies. Absence invites exaggeration. The city's long, gradual sidelining is rewritten as a moral arc, a rise and fall that feels clean enough to teach. Babylon's slow displacement is compressed into sudden downfall because sudden downfall is easier to understand. This compression marks the final separation between Babylon's lived ending and Babylon's remembered one. In reality, the city fades because it is outpaced. In memory, it falls because it is punished. The difference between those two narratives is everything, and once lost, it cannot be recovered. Babylon's real end is too subtle to survive transmission. By the time the city's physical presence becomes marginal, its symbolic presence has reached full independence. Babylon no longer needs to exist at all to function as a reference. It has completed the transition from city to cautionary concept, and once that transition is complete, the physical ground can erode without consequence because the story has already moved on. This is the true end of Babylon as a place. Not conquest, not catastrophe, but replacement so thorough that memory no longer requires geography. The city remains where it is, but history is no longer looking in that direction. History rarely looks back once it has found a more convenient forward path, and Babylon is left behind in exactly this way. The city does not disappear from maps immediately, nor does it empty all at once, but it slips into a kind of historical side room, present yet no longer consulted. Travelers pass through without staying. Administrators operate elsewhere. The rhythms that once synchronized river, law, and sky no longer originate here. Babylon becomes a city that remembers itself better than the world remembers it, holding on to forms whose purpose has quietly migrated. What follows is not collapse, but thinning. Fewer repairs are made because fewer repairs are justified. Infrastructure that once made sense at scale becomes expensive at reduced importance. Canals that powered abundance now demand labor without returning influence. Babylon's greatest strength, its ability to sustain order over long periods, turns into a liability once order is no longer centered there. Stability without relevance becomes weight, and weight without necessity eventually yields to neglect. At the same time, the symbolic Babylon completes its separation from the physical one. As the city's real influence wanes, its imagined influence solidifies. Writers, theologians, and later historians inherit a Babylon that has already been simplified. They do not see the long administrative sunset of the city. They see a moral shape that fits neatly into narratives about pride and punishment. The slow displacement by newer centers is retold as a dramatic reckoning because reckoning feels meaningful in a way replacement does not. This rewriting seals Babylon's fate in memory. The city is no longer allowed to be overtaken by circumstance. It must be overthrown by fate. Its gradual irrelevance is converted into sudden downfall, its technical brilliance into moral excess. Babylon becomes useful again, not as a functioning city, but as a lesson that feels timeless. Accuracy is sacrificed for clarity, and clarity wins. By the time the physical Babylon has truly faded into ruin, the symbolic Babylon is already complete. It no longer depends on archaeology or geography. It lives comfortably in language, detached from place and immune to correction. The city's real end passes almost unnoticed because the Story, people believe, has already concluded elsewhere. This is the final irony of Babylon's disappearance. It is not erased because it failed, nor forgotten because it was insignificant. It is overwritten because it was too influential to remain specific. Its system survived, its name survived, but the city itself, caught between those two survivals, was allowed to drift out of focus, replaced by versions of Babylon that were easier to carry than the truth. And in that drift, Babylon becomes something few cities ever do, a place whose physical end matters less than the moment it stops being needed, a city that does not fall so much as step aside, leaving behind a shadow that grows larger the farther the ground beneath it disappears. That stepping aside is so complete that it almost feels intentional, as if Babylon understood that its work had already been exported and no longer required a stage. The city's long investment in systems ensured that what mattered most could survive relocation. And once relocation proved possible, centrality became optional. Babylon does not resist this realization. It does not reinvent itself as spectacle or cling to relevance through force. It simply remains gradually quieter, increasingly peripheral, until its physical presence no longer interrupts the flow of history that has learned to operate without it. What lingers after this withdrawal is not absence, but imbalance. Babylon's name continues to circulate far more actively than its site, creating a strange asymmetry between memory and matter. The ground grows silent while the word grows loud. This imbalance ensures that Babylon's final disappearance is not noticed as an event because it has already happened conceptually. The city has been gone in practice long before it is gone in fact. Ruin merely confirms what displacement has already decided. In this final condition, Babylon becomes a reference that no longer requires verification. It is cited without footnotes, invoked without context, understood without evidence. Its image is complete enough to function on its own, and completion is dangerous because it discourages curiosity. Few feel compelled to ask what Babylon actually was once its myth feels sufficient. The city's true complexity, its patience, its discipline, its long negotiation with environment and time, is quietly set aside in favor of a cleaner, more dramatic arc. Yet beneath this arc, the real legacy continues to operate undisturbed. Administrative order, written law, calibrated time, abstract authority, these remain indispensable. They do not announce themselves as Babylonian, but they carry Babylon's logic forward regardless. This quiet persistence ensures that Babylon's influence is not diminished by its misrepresentation. If anything, it is strengthened by anonymity. What is no longer named is harder to challenge. This is the final contradiction Babylon leaves behind. The city is condemned in story, while its methods are normalized in practice. It is remembered as a warning while being used as a foundation. Its fall is rehearsed endlessly, while its success is lived daily without acknowledgement. Babylon becomes both obsolete and essential at the same time, a place whose physical erasure has no effect on the systems it released into the world. Here, the narrative reaches a point of no return. Babylon cannot be restored to balance because balance would require giving up a myth that has become culturally useful. The city's real ending, gradual displacement, quiet irrelevance, structural survival, offers no moral clarity, no dramatic lesson. It simply shows how power migrates when it becomes portable, and how cities can lose relevance without losing influence. This is where Babylon finally stops being a city and becomes a condition in which systems outlive their birthplace, meanings drift beyond. Correction and history chooses symbols over processes. Babylon's ground remains where it has always been, but its story has moved on permanently, detached from brick and soil, living instead in the assumptions that govern civilization long after the city itself has finished its work. Once Babylon becomes a condition rather than a location, its story can no longer be resolved by archaeology or chronology, because conditions do not end the way cities do. They persist until something replaces them, and nothing fully replaces the logic Babylon introduced. Later empires refine it, soften it, disguise it, but they do not abandon it. The expectation that power should be organized, documented, predictable, and transferable remains intact. What changes is how openly that expectation is acknowledged. Babylon carried it visibly. The world that followed learned to carry it quietly. In this way, Babylon's final disappearance is not a loss but a concealment, a folding of origin into outcome so complete that separation becomes impossible. The city fades because it has already succeeded in teaching others how to function without it, and teaching, once effective, makes the teacher unnecessary. What remains is a world structured by ideas whose birthplace has been morally simplified, emotionally exaggerated, and strategically forgotten, because remembering it accurately would complicate the narratives that keep modern power comfortable with itself. Babylon's name continues to circulate as a warning precisely because its real lesson is harder to face. That order can endure, that systems can work for a very long time, and that decline does not always arrive as punishment, but as redirection. This truth offers no catharsis, no dramatic reckoning, no assurance that excess will be corrected by collapse. It suggests instead that power often survives by moving, that influence rarely dies where it was born, and that cities do not always fall when they fail, but when they become unnecessary. In that realization, Babylon reaches its quiet conclusion, not as a tragedy, frozen in ruins, but as an origin dissolved into structure, its ground left behind while its logic continues forward, shaping a world that no longer remembers where the pattern began. That forgetting of origin is not accidental, it is functional. Civilization depends on forgetting where its habits come from in order to treat them as natural rather than chosen, inevitable rather than constructed. Babylon's deepest influence survives precisely because it is no longer recognized as Babylonian. Once systems feel natural, they become unquestionable, and once they are unquestionable, they no longer need a story of origin to justify themselves. This is why Babylon's final state is so complete. It does not linger as a challenge to the present, only as a shadow cast backward, used to explain moral fear while leaving structural comfort untouched. The city is remembered as excess so that order itself does not have to be examined. Its myth absorbs the anxiety that might otherwise turn inward. In this way, Babylon functions as a release valve for doubt, allowing societies to inherit its tools while distancing themselves from its responsibility. The irony is total. The city that worked hardest to make order explicit is remembered as an example of order gone wrong, while the descendants of its logic operate within that same order without hesitation. Babylon does not return because it is no longer needed as a place. It persists because it is still needed as an explanation. And explanations, once embedded into language and belief, do not erode. They circulate, they adapt, they harden. The ground where Babylon once stood can fall silent without consequence, because the world no longer looks there for guidance. It looks inward, carrying forward patterns so old they feel like truth itself. And that is where Babylon finally disappears. Not into ruin, not into legend alone, but into the background structure of civilization, where its presence is constant, its name optional, and its origin no longer required to keep the system moving forward. As the fifth movement unfolds, Babylon is no longer the subject at the center of the world, but the reference point it leaves behind. New powers rise, with sharper geographies, faster routes, and fewer constraints. And they do not need to destroy Babylon to replace it. They simply outgrow it. Administration relocates to places that promise efficiency without legacy, authority settles where it can move more freely, and empire learns that permanence does not require continuity. Babylon's long mastery of order becomes a template rather than a destination, and once a template can be replicated, the original loses strategic value. The city remains intact enough to be remembered, but no longer essential enough to be sustained at scale. This is not failure by weakness, but obsolescence by success, the quiet outcome of having taught the world how to function without you. What follows is a subtle shift in how power understands itself. Babylon had centralized order and displayed it. The empires that follow decentralize order and conceal it. They keep the mechanisms, writing, law, measurement, hierarchy, but shed the need for a single symbolic capital that bears the weight of meaning. Power disperses across networks rather than concentrating in a single place. Babylon's mistake, in hindsight, is not excess, but visibility. It made its order legible, monumental, and therefore narratable. Later powers learned to keep order procedural and unseen, allowing systems to operate without inviting myth to gather around them. In this environment, Babylon's symbolic life becomes a liability to its physical one. The more the name is used as a warning, the less incentive there is to preserve the city as a functioning center. Why invest in a place already framed as a moral endpoint? Why anchor authority to a city whose reputation complicates legitimacy? Babylon is left to stand as evidence of a past mode of power, useful as contrast but inconvenient as continuation. It's remaining. Inhabitants live within structures that once defined the future, but now feel like echoes of a logic that has moved on. This is where the idea of collapse finally breaks down. Nothing collapses. There is no decisive blow, no moment of reckoning that matches the drama later assigned to Babylon. Instead, there is a steady redistribution of relevance. The city's influence thins across a widening world, while its physical presence grows heavier with age. Maintenance becomes memory. Memory becomes myth. Myth becomes the primary function of the name. Babylon stops producing power and starts producing meaning for others to use. As empires mature elsewhere, they inherit Babylon's confidence without inheriting its caution. They expand faster, organize larger populations, and trust systems more deeply, all while carrying Babylon as a story that warns them not to go too far. This arrangement is comfortable. It allows ambition to proceed while fear is outsourced to the past. Babylon becomes the place where limits were crossed so that present powers can believe they have learned restraint, even as they rely on the same foundations. By the end of this phase, Babylon's relevance has fully shifted domains. As a city, it is peripheral. As a symbol, it is indispensable. Its ground can erode without consequence because its story is already doing work elsewhere. The city has been relieved of responsibility for the future and assigned a role in explaining the past. In that role, it is endlessly reusable, endlessly cited, and permanently incomplete. This is the final shape of Babylon before the story turns toward its closing reflection. A city that did not fall so much as step aside, leaving behind systems that continued forward, and a name that looked backward, holding together a narrative the world found easier to carry than the truth of how power actually moves. As Babylon recedes further into this peripheral role, its last traces as a living center blur into routine habitation rather than civic purpose. What remains is not a city steering events, but a landscape accommodating them. People live among remnants whose original meaning no longer governs behavior. Temples lose administrative authority, walls lose strategic relevance, and the careful alignments that once staged power dissolve into background. Architecture. Babylon becomes inhabitable without being directive. present without being decisive. This is the final condition of a city that once defined order. It survives as space, not as command. The empires that follow do not mourn this transition. They inherit Babylon's instruments and refine their portability. Authority becomes less tied to place and more to procedure. Capitals are chosen for speed and reach rather than symbolic gravity. Networks replace centers. Babylon's lesson is absorbed completely. Power works best when it can move. The irony is sharp. The city that proved order could be stabilized becomes the example that stability must not be localized. What Babylon perfected, the future abstracts. In this abstraction, Babylon's name grows even more useful as a warning. It becomes the story told to justify distance from origins. By pointing backward at Babylon, later powers claim progress without acknowledging continuity. They frame themselves as having surpassed a flawed ancestor. While relying on its logic at every level, Babylon is positioned as the past that needed correction, so the present can feel legitimate. This maneuver is subtle and effective. It preserves confidence while displacing accountability. The Hanging Gardens, returning again at this stage, function as the final condensation of this maneuver. They encapsulate Babylon as spectacle rather than system, as ambition rather than administration. Whether they ever stood matters less than how perfectly they replaced the city in imagination. A single image stands in for centuries of governance. Wonder substitutes for work. This substitution allows Babylon's complexity to be remembered, without being engaged, admired, without being understood. As the story nears its end, Babylon's fate clarifies into a pattern rather than a plot. Cities that create enduring systems often lose control of their narrative. The more their tools spread, the less their origins matter. The past is simplified so the present can proceed unburdened. Babylon is not singled out by chance. It is selected because it sits at the origin of so much that followed. Making it a warning allows the inheritance to feel cleaner. By now, Babylon no longer asks to be excavated further. Its final relevance lies in what its afterlife reveals about memory itself. We remember cities, not for what they sustained, but for what they symbolize when we need a story. We keep the names that help us explain ourselves and let the mechanisms that actually shape us fade into anonymity. Babylon becomes the archetype of this exchange. In this closing approach, the city's end is neither tragic nor triumphant. It is instructive. Babylon shows how a civilization can complete its work and then be replaced without drama, how influence can persist without recognition, and how myths grow where processes once stood. The ground remains, the name circulates, the systems endure, the city itself is finished, not because it failed, but because it succeeded well enough to make itself unnecessary. That unnecessary state is the last threshold Babylon crosses, and beyond it, there is no return to centrality. Once a city teaches the world how to function, without it, survival becomes symbolic rather than structural. Babylon's streets no longer coordinate power, but its name continues to coordinate meaning. This reversal is subtle, almost elegant. The city withdraws from action and remains as reference, as if its final contribution is to stand still. While history moves around it, what once demanded attention now demands interpretation, and interpretation proves far more durable than infrastructure. At this stage, Babylon exists fully in two incompatible forms. One is physical, eroding quietly into the Mesopotamian plain, visited occasionally, explained cautiously, stripped of urgency. The other is conceptual, endlessly invoked, reshaped, and reinforced through repetition. These two Babylons no longer speak to each other. Archaeology uncovers complexity, while memory insists on simplicity. The gap between them widens until reconciliation is no longer expected, Babylon is allowed to be wrong in order to remain useful. This is where the story begins to turn inward, toward those who keep telling it. Babylon reveals less about ancient Mesopotamia than it does about the needs of later societies. Each time its name is used as a warning, it signals anxiety about scale, control, and permanence. Each retelling strips away another layer of specificity and replaces it with moral certainty. Babylon becomes a stage upon which fears about power are safely rehearsed because the city itself can no longer answer back. The true end of Babylon, then, is not located in time, but in agreement. The moment cultures agree on what Babylon is supposed to mean, the city stops being examined. Consensus replaces curiosity. The story hardens. From that point forward, Babylon's fate is sealed not by erosion or conquest, but by usefulness. It works too well as a symbol to be left alone. As this movement draws toward its conclusion, Babylon's silence becomes complete. Not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of having nothing left to add. Its systems have moved on. Its meaning has been reassigned. Its ground no longer anchors its name. What remains is a lesson, hidden inside distortion, that civilizations often lose control of their legacy at the moment they achieve maximum influence. Babylon does not return to correct its story. It cannot. The world no longer needs correction. It needs confirmation. The myth satisfies that need, and so it endures. The city itself fades into the background of history, not erased, but absorbed, its presence diluted into structure and language until distinction becomes impossible. This is where the fifth movement settles, not with a fall, but with final displacement. Babylon is no longer the place where power is organized, only the place where power is explained away. And in that role it remains permanently active, even as the city itself rests, finished, beneath the plain. With Babylon fully displaced from action into explanation, the story approaches its final turning, where relevance no longer depends on presence at all. The city's last transformation is complete. It has moved from center to periphery, from system to symbol, from necessity to metaphor, and in doing so, it reveals something fundamental about how civilizations age. Power does not always end in destruction. Sometimes it ends in delegation. Babylon delegated its function so effectively that nothing needed to replace it directly. Others simply used what it had already built, carrying its logic forward, while leaving its ground behind. This is why Babylon's end feels unfinished only if one expects catastrophe. In reality, the city completed its task. It taught the world how to stabilize complexity, how to make authority portable, how to separate order from place. Once that lesson was absorbed, Babylon's continued centrality became redundant. The world did not punish Babylon. It moved on with Babylon inside it, and that is the most unsettling conclusion of all, because it offers no moral release, no dramatic justice, no clear warning that power will always be corrected by collapse. It suggests instead that influence can survive indefinitely without recognition, that systems can outlive their creators quietly, and that cities may disappear, not because they fail, but because they succeed so thoroughly that their presence is no longer required. This realization prepares the ground for the final movement, where Babylon's story no longer belongs to antiquity at all, but to the modern instinct to prefer myths over mechanisms, symbols over systems, and stories that feel complete over truths that remain inconveniently open. As the story shifts into this final movement, Babylon stops functioning as a historical case and starts functioning as a mirror held up to the present. What the city ultimately exposes is not ancient failure, but a recurring human preference. The desire for stories that feel finished over systems that remain unresolved. Babylon's myth offers closure, pride, excess, downfall, While Babylon's reality offers continuity, adaptation, and quiet persistence, modern societies inherit both, but they choose which one to carry forward. The myth is lighter. It travels faster. It reassures us that power contains its own correction, that no system can last without being punished for its ambition. The reality is heavier. It suggests that systems can endure, migrate, and normalize themselves so thoroughly that they escape moral accounting altogether. Babylon's fate forces this uncomfortable recognition. Collapse is not guaranteed, and neither is justice. Sometimes order simply moves, shedding its origin and continuing under new names. In that light, Babylon's greatest legacy is not the warning attached to its name, but the unease that lingers once that warning is questioned. If Babylon did not fall because it was wicked, if it did not vanish because it failed, then what does that say about the systems we trust today, the structures we assume will correct themselves, the belief that excess must always lead to ruin? Babylon leaves these questions unanswered because it cannot answer them without undoing the myth that keeps it useful. And so the city remains suspended between what it was and what it is allowed to mean, its ground silent, its name active, its influence ongoing. From here, the story no longer needs Babylon to continue forward in time. It needs Babylon only as a reference point against which modern confidence, modern order, and modern faith in systems can be measured. This is the threshold of the ending, where the city finally recedes completely, and what remains is not Babylon itself, but the world that thinks it has moved beyond it while still living inside the patterns it made possible. As Babylon reaches this last turn, the story no longer needs expansion, only release. The city has already said everything it can say through its disappearance. What remains is a final alignment between myth, system, and modern habit. Babylon's greatest illusion was never the hanging gardens or towering walls, but the belief that order once created could remain owned by its creators. In reality, order travels, it detaches, it survives by shedding names and places. Babylon proved this first, and paid for it by losing control of how it would be remembered. The gardens endure not because they explain Babylon, but because they allow us to replace complexity with image, labor with wonder, systems with story, and that choice continues today. Wherever myths feel safer than mechanisms, wherever we prefer endings that feel earned over processes that simply continue, Babylon does not warn us that power will fall. It warns us that power will move on without asking permission, leaving behind symbols where structures once stood. The city is gone, its name remains, its logic persists unseen. That is not a tragedy or a triumph, it is a condition. And once seen, clearly it needs no further explanation. And with that recognition, Babylon finally settles into silence. Not the silence of erasure, but the silence of completion. There is nothing left to excavate that would change its meaning, because the meaning no longer lives in the ground. Babylon's story ends not where its ruins lie, but where its logic became so common that it stopped being questioned. The hanging gardens fade back into what they always were, a mirror of human preference, proof that we choose images over infrastructures, legends over ledgers, stories over systems. Babylon does not ask to be judged or redeemed. It simply stands as the first clear example of a truth that still governs the present, that civilizations rarely end when they collapse, but when they succeed so completely that their origin no longer matters. Power survives by moving, order survives by hiding, and memory survives by simplifying. Babylon was not lost in the desert. It was absorbed into the world, and once absorbed, it no longer needed to speak.